Has America given up the right to have rights? Has this nation somehow breached a line between what was and what is that tells us the Constitution and some of the rights therein no longer apply to the society in which we live? Let's talk about it. All eyes have been on the state of Texas for the last few days. The week before that, our gaze went from a shooting in California to one in Buffalo, New York, and now back to the Lone Star State. In the immediate aftermath, as is typical of these events, you started seeing the shots fired, the left calling the right out for supposedly being passive on gun laws, the right calling out the left for trying to legislate away the tool and not dealing with mental health issues, and all of those things happening, all of those responses being stirred up. Among them came this call for someone to do something.
Nothing's happened with our team in the last 6 hours. We're going to start the same way tonight. Any basketball questions don't matter. Since we left shoot-around, 14 children were killed 400 miles from here, and a teacher. And in the last 10 days, we've had elderly black people killed in a supermarket in Buffalo. We've had Asian churchgoers killed in Southern California, and now we have children murdered at school. When are we going to do something?
It's time to do something. Steve Kerr, that's the coach of the Golden State Warriors, speaking out saying it is time for someone to do something to stop the madness of violence in this nation. And I appreciate his heartfelt plea for something to be done, but I notice he quickly put the onus on politicians. He instantly said there's 50 senators that are apparently holding the nation hostage in stopping what he felt were the proper type of laws from being enacted. Now, I think something should be done. I would go so far, in fact, to say that something must be done. This violence that we are seeing in our nation is unacceptable. We cannot live in a place where we're sending our children to school wondering if they're going to be shot. For that matter, walking down our streets wondering if someone is going to be shot, if a robbery is going to occur, if we're going to be in the middle of a shootout between two rival factions of people moving drugs in the neighborhood. But saying that something must be done is not the same as offering a real solution. And we come to these moments, you have the obvious answer that people jump to is that we need more laws. We need some way to legislate these guns out of the hands of those who would perpetrate violence. We saw that in the comments of Coach Kerr. 50 senators, if this would just happen. We saw in the same day, senators take to the floor to take a moment to beg, they said, for change to happen in laws. Of course, that raises the question of what about the Second Amendment? The Second Amendment is quite clear. It's been determined by the Supreme Court on multiple occasions that individuals in the United States have the right to bear arms. They have the right to own weapons. They have the right to own guns. So how do we take that right and balance it against what we're seeing happen? What's going on? Is there an issue with that right? Is there an issue with our interpretation of that right? What's actually happening here? Before you jump to a solution, it would be good to take a look at history. How long has the right for Americans to bear arms been there? Well, since the beginning. How long have young people had access to guns? Well, in many communities under the age of 18, young people have had access to guns for hunting and sport shooting and other purposes for many, many years. How long has an 18-year-old been able to go and purchase such a weapon? For quite some time. Folks will say, well, these semi-automatic weapons, how long have semi-automatic weapons been around? about a century. So when we start asking these questions, we have to ask ourselves, why do we suddenly see so much violence? Why, practicing the same rights that have always been, do we see this violence now? What has changed? Now, what has changed might be disturbing, it might be upsetting, but it is reality. This nation has left its moral and religious roots. Take a look at what's happening with church attendance in this nation. Take a look at what's happening in people who claim to be part of a religious group in this nation. Take a look at how many people are practicing their faith. Go take a look at those statistics and you will find out that America is quickly becoming an a-religious country, a country that does not have a religion that it adheres to, a country full of people that increasingly are becoming secular in their thinking, secular in their decision making, secular in their morality. America has abandoned her morality. Morality in our nation almost no longer exists. Things that were once deemed quite immoral are now considered as simply another way to live life. The idea of marriage, the idea of having children within marriage, the idea of having mother and father in nuclear family, those things are under attack and are almost no longer existent. Marriage vows are no longer valued. We see more and more children being raised in situations that are outside of what the societal norm has been for strong societies for centuries, and not to mention being outside of God's plan for the family. We see things that at one time would have led to a person being treated as an absolute pariah due to their immorality, now being treated as just, that person's just a little different than the rest of us, or that person just decided that it was okay to go and not be faithful to their vows. And we see these things happening and we wonder what's going on. And I know this is a difficult message to receive, but the fact is, when we gave up our morality, a nation that murders children in the womb, a nation that promotes promiscuity everywhere, a nation that is obsessed with sinfulness and sex and immorality, a nation in which our cohabitation rates have gone through the roof, a nation in which our fatherless children rates have gone through the roof, a nation in which every factor that points to strong societies has been destroyed by our deciding that we know a better way. That nation is now seeing what happens then. We no longer have a moral society. We no longer have a religious society where our children are being taught right and wrong by religious authority. And what happens when that happens? Well, you begin to lose all measure of right and wrong. In fact, you begin to have a collapse of the very thing that is required for our Constitution to work. You see, friends, our Constitution was not written for secular people. It was not written for a society in which people did not adhere to religious practice. It was not written for a society in which morality could be defined by whatever you wanted it to be. Our Constitution was written by people who assumed they would be writing for a society that operated under basic Christian, Judeo-Christian values, with moral codes that were well understood by the entirety of the society. And when we began to step away from morality as defined by really God's law, as understood by the Judeo-Christian tradition, when we began to step away from being parts of religious groups, being parts of a house of faith, when we begin to step away from things like weekly church attendance, when we begin to step away from things like our faith being a large part of our life, we begin to step away from a society in which the Constitution can function. These rights were never meant to be put in the hands of an immoral, unreligious people. John Adams, the second president of the United States, had this to say: "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." Our Constitution will not work in an immoral and unreligious nation. So now we arrive at a point at which a decision must be made. We are either going to have to return to being a moral and religious people, or we are going to have to take serious looks at the Constitution and determine which rights need to be changed. When you live in a society that does not value life, you cannot have free access to weapons. When you live in a society where immorality abounds, when you live in a society where we've gotten so far away from everything that God intended and everything that the framers of the nation assumed, then many of our rights are going to have to be reconsidered. Or we can see a return to morality and religiosity. We can see a return to the ways of God. One of those two things is going to have to happen. It is not likely that we're going to see major changes to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. It's not likely that we're going to see major changes to gun laws in the days ahead. It's not likely that that's going to do anything to stop these situations. Perhaps we could make schools and other places of gathering more hard targets, or we could go back to that other thing, and that is returning to being a moral and religious people. So let me say this to those of you, especially believers, who are calling out for something to be done. So believers that want something to be done, here's what you can do. You can gather your family and be in God's house this Sunday. You can be faithful to your vows. You can keep your relationships within the way that God says that they ought to be in the scriptures, so that you can raise children in a family according to God's word and according to what we know that research has shown is the best for the child. Fathers, you can take responsibility for your children. Mothers, you can be sure to be showing them the ways of God. All of us can be sure to stop allowing ourselves to be pushed around by those who would push immorality upon us. It's time to stop accepting things that God has called abominable. It's time for us to stand for what is right and true and good and moral. And only when we find ourselves once again a moral and a religious people will we be able to carry these rights that I believe are God-given, but that are constitutionally recognized. It is only when we once again train our children in the ways of God. It's only when we, as a society, value life. It is only when we understand that there is a moral code that goes beyond my whims and wishes and the wants of the moment, but that there is a right and wrong that goes deeper, that there are absolutes. It is only then that we will be able to keep these rights that we have inherited from the generations before us. So there's the challenge. If you want to do something, walk out your faith. Let us see our nation turn once again to the morality and to, yes, the Christian roots upon which she was founded. God bless you all.